It's your time, South Jersey, and our time on AM 1490 Sports Betting Radio for Extending the Play with your host, NFL insider John McMullen.
Today's program is presented by Malamut Law, Cherry Hill Disc Centers, and Dr. Charles McCabe, Del Val Insurance, and Thrive Financial Services.
Now, here's John McMullen.
E-A-T-L-E-S, Eagles!
Welcome in, South Jersey. Another edition of Extending the Play as we get through this winter. But this is a very special edition because finally, after 19 days of being held hostage by rumors and innuendo, Carson Wentz is gone. Carson Wentz is no longer a member of the Philadelphia Eagles. It will not be official, of course, until March 17th, the start of the NFL's new league year. If you've been paying attention on social media, Carson's already been in Indianapolis. He's already taken a private jet. He's already started to introduce himself to his new teammates, and he has turned the page on Philadelphia. Actually going on Instagram and saying his goodbye, thanking the organization, thanking Jeffrey Lurie, Howie Roseman for drafting him and giving him the opportunity to make his dream come true and be an NFL player. All of that is sort of the typical lifespan when you see a situation and a divorce in sports and things go poorly. And that's where we are. It's kind of amazing. If you go back to Super Bowl 52, I talk about it all the time with Doug Peterson leaving and not lasting essentially 3 calendar years. And then you have Carson Wentz signing his extension, and he doesn't last 2 calendar years. But you do get the Lombardi Trophy out of it. So there is some good. But when things like this happen and the fracture is sort of new, most of the focus is on the bad. We're gonna get to all of it and everything involving Carson Wentz and everything that went wrong on this special edition of Extending the Play. To do it, we're gonna have my good friend Bob Grotz on the program. Nobody does a better job. He's been around the Philadelphia Eagles as a beat writer longer than anybody. He's from the Delaware County Times, so he'll be here after the break. But before we kind of set up Bob and we kind of get in the nuts and bolts of this thing, I did want to talk about the generalities of the entire process. And it starts with what the Eagles got in return. And certainly – You look at a return of investment, not great. If you think about the history of this player and the history of this organization and where they were in 2016, which bottom line, guys, I mean, they traded 5 draft choices to get Carson Wentz from number 13, where they originally stood. They leapfrogged up to number 10, ultimately all the way up to number 2. To get Carson Wentz, who was supposed to be the face of this franchise. And it started out great. And if you think about that 2017 season and where the Eagles were and where Carson Wentz was at 11-2, sort of a heroic going off his shield at against the Los Angeles Rams with the torn ACL, torn LCL. Last play, throwing a touchdown on a torn ACL, which is pretty impressive. And you look at where it's gone from there, and there's been incremental sort of stages to the decline. A lot of it has to do with the injury situation, not only that knee injury, but also the back injury and the concussion. You can throw that in with Jadeveon Clowney. So significant injuries. Significant personality problems. You talk about Joe Santoliquito, the Philly voice piece. That's probably where it all started. Then you have the fracture with Doug Peterson. And you have the dead cap money, which is $33.8 million, the largest cap hit in NFL history to get rid of Carson Wentz, and the return. And that return on investment, which is, as I said, is going to be a 3rd-round pick this year and a 2nd-round pick next year, which could turn into a first depending on what Carson Wentz does in Indianapolis. It's not optimal. By no means is it optimal. If you look at this league in general, take last year, for instance, Stephon Diggs, who's a wide receiver, forces his way out of Minnesota. The Vikings get a first-round pick. If you look at Jamal Adams, unhappy with the New York Jets, kind of forces his way out as a safety. The Jets get 2 first-round picks. So when you look at it from that standpoint and you say, this is a quarterback, this is the most important position on the field, and the Eagles weren't able to get a first-round pick on paper. Again, if Carson Wentz plays well next season, plays 75% of the snaps or 70% and the Colts make the playoffs, that turns into a first-round pick. So if he's healthy, you're probably going to get that first-round pick. Conversely, if you look at it from the Colts side, well, if they make the playoffs, they're happy to give up that pick. It's going to be in the 20s. It's going to be a late first-round pick. And then from there, you kind of say to yourself, as a general manager in this league, there's a way of doing business. And it's not necessarily the way to do it, to burn bridges. In other words, you can I always describe it like this, and I always use Sam Hinkie as the example. One of the issues with Sam Hinkie and the Sixers was that he alienated other general managers. In other words, the goal isn't always to win every trade and sort of rub it into the opposing general manager's face and rout them and everyone, because why? You have to continue to do business with these people. So from that standpoint, professionalism enters into it, and Chris Ballard doesn't have an issue with giving up a first-round pick for Carson Wentz if he succeeds in Indianapolis. And again, it's going to be in the 20s, and that's not really that substantial when you look at where Carson Wentz was from a value standpoint, even at the beginning of the 2020 season. So the decline was pretty steep. It continued. The fracture made things worse. The fact that he couldn't get along with the organization. All this contributes to this fact that you can't get the value that people necessarily wanted and people thought they could potentially get for Carson Wentz. Remember, the first story out there floated was 2 first-round picks, and that was always laughable. We told you on this show that was laughable. It wasn't going to happen, and here we are. But the positive part, you finally get to turn the page, and you finally get to go on to the next chapter, and now it's about building. And whether that building starts with a new head coach, and Nick Sirianni, it certainly does, but whether it starts with Jalen Hurts as the next quarterback, the Eagles are intent behind the scenes on adding sort of competition. And we'll see what that competition looks like, whether it's a draft choice, whether it's a veteran bridge quarterback, whether it's a top pick, if it's in that top 10, if it's number 6 overall versus a second or third round pick. I think all of that will factor in to the Eagles' evaluation, what they think of Jalen Hurts, and kind of foreshadow that for you. And we're going to get into all of this with my buddy, as I said, Bob Groats from the Delaware County Times. When we talk about turning the chapter, and you got to remember the good along with the bad. But this special edition of Extending the Play is going to continue after the break, as I mentioned, with Bob Groats from the Delaware County Times, the dean of the Eagles beat writers, the guy who hosts the Pro Football Report with the voice of the Philadelphia Eagles, the legendary Merrill Reese. More Extending the Play here on AM 1490 Sports Betting Radio after the break.
The The middle.
It's called the Gonza Fort Peninsula Park.
Looks nice.
It's a nice green space.
Right. Just looks like, what's the park in the middle of New York?
Central Park?
Central Park, yeah. Central Park, yeah.
Most famous park in the world.
Right. It's probably the most famous green space on the planet.
The Middle with Eitan Shander, Barrett Brooks, and Harry Mays. Weekdays from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern.
You're listening to the JAKIB Media Sports Network in partnership with AM 1490 Sports Betting Radio. Subscribe to the JAKIB Media channel on YouTube for access to all daily sports content.
Welcome back, South Jersey, extending the play here on AM 1490 Sports Betting Radio. We're trying to get my buddy Bob Groats on the line, having some technical difficulties, and we'll continue to talk about Carson Wentz, the Philadelphia Eagles, moving forward, and that's what this team is about right now. We've finally gotten to the point we all knew it was going to happen. It was just a matter of when, not if, and we finally have the win. So if you want to look at the positive side, and you want to look at this team and their ability to move forward with a new head coach and Nick Sirianni, a new coaching staff, which is very young. We've talked a lot about that, and my piece for the Philly Voice, which kind of got pushed back a day because of the Carson Wentz trade, was about the youth on that Eagles coaching staff. And if you think about it, it starts with Nick Sirianni, who's not going to turn 40 until June. His offensive coordinator, Shane Steichen, is 35 years old. His defensive coordinator, Jonathan Gannon, is 37. And at points, you get even younger than that. Michael Clay is the new special teams coordinator. He will be the youngest coordinator in the NFL right now at 29 years old. He passes Joe Brady, who incidentally was one of the 10 people who interviewed for this job when Nick got it. And then you talk about Nick Rollis, who's the linebackers coach, who's the youngest position coach in the NFL at 27 years old. And we talk about Alex Singleton, the best linebacker the Eagles had last year. He's 27 years old. And there was some news on that front and the fact that Jannard Avery, his personal footwork coach, tweeted out yesterday the Eagles are going to move him to linebacker. So you have all these moving parts, all these young coaches. And bottom line is you have a quarterback that was disgruntled. You had certain players that are disgruntled. Zach Ertz, I think, is the next domino to fall. Deshaun Jackson was released yesterday, as everyone expected. The Eagles have already highlighted their post-June 1st cuts. Those are going to be Alshon Jeffrey, Malik Jackson. From a bookkeeping standpoint, they will be labeled as post-June 1st, but one of the reasons they reworked their deal to give the Eagles a little salary cap relief earlier than that is so they can get on the open market early and try to get new jobs when at the beginning of free agency. And there's not necessarily the glut where people have already made their moves and aren't interested in adding players. So you have all these moving parts. And the Eagles were up against it for a number of reasons. And so many things in our country as a whole are blamed on the pandemic, and understandably so. COVID-19 has done so many things to our country, shut it down at points, locked it down, different parts of the country. And the impact on a much smaller world, and that's the NFL, as big as it is in sports, it doesn't really matter when it comes to real-world things. But this is the first time in NFL history that the salary cap is going down. And it's going down because of the lost revenues from COVID-19, the empty stadiums. Obviously, you don't have everything that encompasses that when you talk about revenue, whether it's parking, concessions, ticket revenue, so forth and so on. So for the first time in NFL history, the salary cap is going down. We don't know what that number is going to be. We do know, coming off last week, the lowest it can possibly be is $180 million per team. Now, why this is such a big issue is it was 198.2 last year. So understand, as you budget, and teams generally budget in increments of 2-3 years, you have to think about, if you're Howie Roseman, you have to think about more than just 2021. You have to think about 2022, 2023, and moving forward. I know a lot of fans aren't happy with that because they want Howie fired, but that's the reality of his job. He's got to think, be more forward-thinking than, say, a head coach who's got to think about beating his next opponent. So when all this started, before it started, as you budgeted for 2020, say, and then 2021, well, your assumption is, because it always has been, that the salary cap is going up before COVID-19. It was probably going to go up about 10%. That's the way it had been ascending pre-pandemic. Now, all of a sudden, it's going down. So you've already budgeted all these players, all these big money contracts prior to getting this significant hit. So that's why the Eagles are in such desperate straits. And the take on, and we've talked about this a lot on Extending the Play, the take on $33.8 million in dead cap money, which is so by far the NFL record. They shattered the precedent by over 50%. It went from 22.2 to 33.8 million when they traded Carson Wentz. So you have that, and that's why the dominoes have to fall as far as big name players. And it started, as we mentioned, with Deshaun Jackson. We all know Malik Jackson's going to be a part of that. Alshon Jeffrey, Zach Ertz. The Eagles are trying to trade him right now as we speak. And Zach would like out of Philadelphia as well, by the way. So you have a situation where the LA Chargers are involved. The Baltimore Ravens are involved. The Green Bay Packers in the past, Seattle Seahawks, Buffalo Bills. Question is, do they want a high-priced aging tight end who's now going to be on the wrong side of 30, and what are they going to give up for him? And it's probably, again, I think fans look at a player like Zach Ertz, and they say, okay, this is a great player. He has been a great player for a number of years. What are we going to do? How are we going to get him out of this organization? And if you do get him out of this organization, you better get a second, third round pick. You're not going to get a second or third round pick. Again, the money is such a big aspect to this in the NFL, and this year more than ever, because it's not just the Eagles that have taken that hit from COVID-19. It's every other team. So when you talk about big money players, there's going to be less of them. There's going to be more big name talent on the open market. And that means more demand, supply and demand, the old thing you were taught in high school. There is a lot of demand. There's always demand for good players, but the supply is going to be far greater than it typically is, and that's the landscape the Eagles are dealing with. So in a lot of ways, the trade of Carson Wentz, what it does is they have essentially, the Philadelphia Eagles have held their nose, and they're taking their medicine, and they're saying, okay, we have to take a step back, and maybe we can take 2 steps forward. It's a very difficult process, especially for an organization that has been so successful since really Andy Reid arrived in 1999. This fan base is a bit spoiled. They're not used to rebuilding years. They're not used to transition years. And Jeffrey Lurie himself used that term transition. And it's because the rebuilding word is has such a negative connotation when it comes to the fan base. But that's what it means. That's really what it means. And you can try to spin it in every other direction. But you can either be honest with yourself or, play it pie in the sky. And I think most Eagles fans kind of understand this process has to be different than it has been. They thought the championship window was open a little bit longer than it probably should have been. And that arguably is the biggest mistake the Eagles have made to this point when you talk about this window of Super Bowl 52 forward and the coining of the phrase the new normal. Well, the Eagles were very astute and early in that process trying to get, okay, we got one, let's get another one. And the problem is they kept talking themselves into, with these late season playoff runs, they kept talking themselves into this theory that we're closer than maybe people realize. And if we get to the postseason, you never know what happens. And if we get to that point, we can kind of make another run at a Super Bowl championship. And to be honest, they needed to be more honest with themselves. They needed to turn the page quicker. And that's part of the reason they're in this conundrum. And we've started this process of this transition and this rebuild. And now we got to go forward. And now it's about doing it the best way possible. And speaking of the best way possible, we're going to try to clear up these technical difficulties. We're going to try to get my buddy Bob Groats on the line. If not, I might bring in Joe Kraus from JAKIB Media, but we'll see. Stay tuned, South Jersey, AM 1490, Sports Betting Radio. The Carson Wentz trade edition of Extending the Play marches on after the break.